Have you ever felt like giving up on learning English, on love, or even on your relationship because everything felt too difficult to understand? In this video, I will share a real story from my life in the United States where cultural differences, language struggles, and marriage challenges almost broke us apart until one simple way of practicing English slowly changed everything. Bold question about love and language. Some people think the hardest part of learning English is grammar. Others think it is vocabulary. But in my life, the hardest part was something very different. The hardest part was trying to understand the person I loved in a language that was not my own. Life in the United States has a strange way of testing you. It tests your patience, your confidence, and sometimes even your relationships. When culture, language, and expectations mix together, small misunderstandings can slowly grow into big emotional storms. And that is exactly what almost happened in my marriage. This story is not only about learning English. It is about learning how to listen slowly, carefully, and with curiosity. It is also about how a simple habit of practicing English through stories became one of the most powerful tools that saved my relationship. Let's go back to the beginning. When I first arrived in the United States, everything felt new and slightly overwhelming. The streets were bigger. The supermarkets were brighter. Even the air felt different. Winter was colder than I expected, and the wind had a sharpness that I had never experienced before. But weather was not the real surprise. The real surprise was how different everyday English sounded in real life. Before coming to America, I had studied English for years. I could read articles online. I could watch English videos with subtitles. I believed my listening skills were fairly good. In my mind, I imagined conversations in the United States would feel similar to what I had practiced. Reality, however, had its own personality. People spoke quickly. Words connected together. Expressions appeared that I had never learned in any textbook. Sometimes a sentence would start clearly and then suddenly disappear into sounds my brain could not process fast enough. My mind felt like an old computer trying to run new software. Now imagine something even more complicated, trying to build a relationship while your brain is still translating every sentence. Around that time, I had already met the woman who would later become my wife. She grew up in the United States, surrounded by American culture, American humor, and a natural rhythm of English that moved quickly and smoothly. When she spoke, her sentences flowed like a river. When I listened, my brain felt like it was building a bridge, one word at a time. At first, our conversations were simple and full of curiosity. We talked about food, music, travel, and small experiences from our childhoods. Those early conversations were beautiful because both of us were discovering each other's worlds. But something interesting began happening as our relationship grew deeper. The topics became more serious. Feelings, expectations, future plans, family values. And those conversations required a deeper level of understanding. Sometimes she would explain something emotional, and I would catch only part of the meaning. Other times I would answer too quickly, because I thought I understood her sentence. A few seconds later, the expression on her face would tell me something was wrong. Not anger, confusion. That quiet moment when two people realize they heard the same words, but understood completely different meanings. Linguists and psychologists often explain that language is not only about vocabulary. Language carries culture inside it. Tone of voice, Humor, pauses, and even silence all communicate meaning. When someone learns a new language, the brain must process these signals at the same time. If the brain cannot process everything quickly enough, it fills the missing pieces with guesses. And guesses are not always correct. One evening made this very clear to me. We were sitting together in a small cafe in the city. Outside, the winter wind moved through the streets, and the windows were slightly foggy from the warm air inside. The cafe was quiet, with soft music playing in the background. She said something about our future. I thought I understood, so I answered confidently. But her reaction surprised me. Her eyebrows moved slightly upward, and the warmth in her expression disappeared for a moment. "What do you mean?" she asked. Suddenly, my confidence disappeared. I realized something uncomfortable. I was not completely sure what she had meant in the first place. Moments like that can feel small, but they slowly build pressure inside a relationship. When misunderstandings repeat many times, frustration can quietly grow on both sides. For a while, I tried the strategy many language learners use. Smiling, nodding, pretending to understand. It felt easier in the moment, but it was not a real solution. Then something interesting happened. Instead of focusing on complicated grammar or memorizing long vocabulary lists, I began practicing English in a different way. I started listening to simple stories in English every day. Slow stories, clear stories, stories about real life, emotions, and experiences. At first, it felt almost too easy, but something powerful was happening inside my brain. Neuroscientists explain that storytelling activates multiple areas of the brain at once: language processing, emotional memory, and imagination. When words are connected to human experiences, the brain remembers them more easily and understands them more naturally. In other words, stories train the brain to think in a language instead of translating it. The change did not happen overnight, but little by little something shifted. I became more patient when listening. Instead of rushing to answer, I started paying attention to tone, rhythm, and emotion. I began asking simple questions when something was unclear. "Could you say that again? What exactly do you mean?" These sentences were small, but they were powerful. Communication slowly improved. More importantly, trust improved. And that was the moment I realized something surprising. Learning English slowly was not only improving my language skills, it was strengthening my relationship. Because real communication is not about speaking perfectly. It is about understanding deeply. Still, cultural differences have a way of appearing when you least expect them. Just when things started feeling comfortable, another challenge appeared, one that forced both of us to question whether love alone was enough. And that challenge began during one very ordinary day in America, a day that taught me how different life here could truly be. My first confusing days in America. The first morning in the United States felt strangely quiet. Not because the city was silent. Far from it. Cars moved quickly down the street, people walked with confident steps. And somewhere nearby, a bus released a long mechanical sigh as its doors opened. But inside my mind, everything felt quiet for a different reason. My brain was busy trying to understand the world. Moving to another country sounds exciting when people talk about it. Friends imagine new opportunities, new adventures, and a fresh beginning. And yes, all of that is true. But there is another side that most people don't talk about enough. The small confusion of everyday life. In your home country, life runs automatically. You know how people greet each other. You understand jokes. You recognize the tone someone uses when they're serious or when they're just teasing you. Your brain processes these signals instantly. In a new country, those signals suddenly become puzzles. My first week in America felt like walking through a movie where everyone else had the full script except me. For example, something as simple as buying coffee became a learning experience. One morning, I walked into a small coffee shop near my apartment. The smell of roasted beans filled the air, and people stood in a line that moved surprisingly fast. When it was my turn, the barista smiled and said something friendly. The problem was, I only understood about half of it. Her sentence sounded like a long river of connected words. My brain quickly tried to separate them into pieces. Was she asking about the size of the coffee? The type of milk? The flavor? My mind worked quickly, searching through every English class I had ever taken. Finally, I answered with the safest sentence I could think of. Just a regular coffee, please. She nodded politely and prepared the drink. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but it left my brain slightly tired. Not because the situation was difficult, but because my mind had to work twice as hard to understand something that native speakers process automatically. And that was only coffee. Now, imagine that kind of effort happening all day long, listening to conversations on the street, watching the news on television, talking with coworkers. Each situation required careful attention. Each sentence was like a small puzzle. Psychologists call this phenomenon cognitive load. When learning a new language, the brain must process pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, and context at the same time. This creates mental fatigue, especially during the early stages of immersion in a new culture. But here is the interesting part. That mental effort is also exactly what helps the brain grow. Neuroscience research shows that language immersion activates neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to create new connections between neurons. In simple terms, your brain slowly builds new pathways that make understanding easier over time. Still, during the first months, progress can feel painfully slow, and that slow progress can affect confidence. There were moments when I questioned my ability to adapt. Sometimes after a long day of listening and translating in my head, I returned home feeling mentally exhausted. My brain wanted silence. But life in the United States doesn't slow down just because you are learning. People move quickly here. Conversations move quickly too. And somewhere in the middle of this fast environment, my relationship with the woman who would later become my wife was also growing. She had lived in America her entire life. For her, conversations flowed naturally. Humor appeared in unexpected moments. Cultural references from movies, television, and childhood memories shaped the way she spoke. Many of those references were completely new to me. At first, those differences felt charming. We laughed when I misunderstood certain expressions. Sometimes she would explain an idiom, and I would repeat it slowly until it sounded natural. But as time passed, I began noticing something deeper. Language shapes perception. The way people speak reflects how they think. And cultural expectations are often hidden inside ordinary sentences. For example, Americans often communicate directly. If something bothers them, they tend to express it clearly. In other cultures, Communication may be softer or more indirect. These differences can create confusion even when both people have good intentions. One afternoon, during a simple conversation about daily plans, I misunderstood something important she said. The sentence itself was not complicated, but the meaning behind it carried cultural expectations I had not yet learned. My response sounded strange to her. Her reaction surprised me. A short moment of silence appeared between us. Nothing dramatic happened that day.
No shouting.
No big argument. But I could feel a small misunderstanding quietly forming beneath the surface. That moment taught me an important lesson. Learning English was not only about vocabulary. It was about understanding how people think, feel, and communicate in a different culture. And that realization slowly changed the way I practiced English. Instead of focusing only on textbooks, I began searching for something more natural. Real stories, real conversations, and slow listening practice that allowed my brain to absorb language step by step. Every evening I spent time listening to simple English stories. I repeated sentences aloud. I paid attention to rhythm, tone, and emotional meaning. Little by little, my brain started recognizing patterns. Words that once sounded like noise became clear sentences. Sentences became meaningful conversations. And conversations began shaping the future of my relationship. Because the better I understood English, the better I understood the person standing beside me. Still, cultural differences have a curious way of appearing at unexpected moments. Just when communication started improving, something new entered the story, something that would test both our patience and our understanding in ways I had never imagined. And, strangely enough, that challenge began with a simple conversation on an ordinary afternoon, the day I truly realized how fast my future wife could speak. The woman who spoke too fast. Speed can change everything. Not the speed of a car or a train, but the speed of a conversation. In language learning, speed is often the invisible wall standing between understanding and confusion. Words that are clear when spoken slowly can suddenly become a blur when spoken at normal American speed. And that invisible wall appeared very clearly the day I began spending more time with the woman who would later become my wife. She was warm, intelligent, and full of energy. The kind of person who could enter a room and immediately start a conversation with anyone. Her laughter came easily, and her stories moved quickly from one idea to another. She spoke the way many Americans do. Naturally, confidently, and fast. Very fast. At the beginning, I didn't notice the challenge. When two people first meet, conversations are simple. Questions are easy. Where are you from? What do you like to do? What kind of music do you enjoy? These topics gave me time to think. But as we started spending more time together, our conversations grew deeper. She talked about her childhood, her dreams, and her opinions about life in America. Sometimes she would tell a long story about something that happened at work or with her friends. And that was when my brain began running a marathon. While she was speaking, my mind worked quickly to process each sentence. I tried to recognize the vocabulary, connect the grammar, and understand the emotion behind her words. But sometimes by the time I understood the first part of her sentence, she had already started the third one. Imagine trying to watch a movie where the subtitles appear 2 seconds too late. That was how my brain felt during some conversations. But here is something interesting about human communication. People rarely realize how fast they are speaking. Native speakers don't notice it because their brains process language automatically. Language scientists explain that fluent speakers recognize entire groups of words at once instead of translating them individually. This is why their speech sounds smooth and continuous. For language learners, however, the brain often processes words one by one. That difference creates a small but important gap. At first, I handled the situation in a way that many language learners know very well. I smiled. I nodded. And sometimes I answered with short responses that felt safe. Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, interesting. I see what you mean. These phrases became my survival tools. The problem, of course, was that I didn't always fully understand what she meant. And misunderstandings have a quiet way of growing over time. One afternoon we were walking through a park. It was early spring in America, the kind of day when the cold winter air begins to soften. The trees were still mostly bare, but small signs of green were starting to appear. She was telling me a story about something that happened at work. Her words moved quickly, full of expressions and small jokes. I followed the beginning of the story without much trouble. Then she used an idiom I had never heard before. My brain stopped. It tried to translate the phrase literally, but the meaning didn't make sense. While my mind searched for an explanation, she continued speaking. The story moved forward, and I was suddenly lost in the middle of it. When she finished, she looked at me and asked a question. My brain had two choices. Option 1. Ask her to repeat the story. Option 2. Pretend to understand and answer quickly. For a moment, my pride chose the second option. I gave an answer that sounded reasonable. But the moment the words left my mouth, I saw something change in her expression. She looked at me carefully and said, "That's not what I meant." Those 5 words felt heavier than I expected, not because she sounded angry, but because they revealed something uncomfortable. The conversation we thought we were sharing had actually become 2 different conversations in our minds. This is where language learning becomes emotional. Misunderstandings in English are not only academic mistakes. They can affect feelings, expectations, and relationships. Communication experts often say that successful relationships depend on something very simple: feeling understood. When someone believes their partner truly hears them, trust grows naturally. But when messages are misunderstood, even unintentionally, small cracks can appear. That day in the park was not a dramatic argument, but it was an important moment of awareness. I realized something that many language learners eventually discover. Understanding English is not only about knowing words. It is about recognizing meaning at the speed of real life. And that ability does not come from memorizing long vocabulary lists. It grows through exposure, through listening, through stories. Around that time, I began experimenting with a different way of practicing English. Instead of forcing my brain to process fast conversations all the time, I started listening to slower English stories every day. Stories about daily life. Stories about relationships. Stories about ordinary people facing challenges. At first, it felt almost too simple. But slowly, something remarkable happened. My listening ability improved. My brain started recognizing patterns more quickly. Idioms that once confused me began appearing again in different stories, making their meanings clearer. And perhaps most importantly, my confidence began to grow. Instead of pretending to understand, I felt more comfortable asking questions. Can you explain that expression? What does that phrase mean? Surprisingly, those questions didn't create distance between us. They created connection. Because real communication is not about pretending to understand everything. It is about being curious enough to keep learning. Still, life has a way of testing new progress. Just when our conversation started improving, another layer of complexity appeared, something even more powerful than language itself. Culture. And when love meets cultural differences, communication becomes more than words. It becomes a lesson about patience, perspective, and the courage to understand someone else's world. That lesson began unfolding slowly during the next stage of our relationship, when love started growing between two very different cultures. Love growing between two cultures. Love often begins in a simple way. Two people meet, they laugh together, and conversations feel light and effortless. At that stage, differences can even feel exciting. A different culture sounds interesting. A different accent sounds charming. New habits feel like small adventures. But as time passes, love begins to grow roots. And when roots grow, they reach deeper layers of life. Family traditions, expectations about marriage, ways of solving problems, and even the meaning of respect. That was the stage where our relationship slowly arrived. At first, everything about our cultural differences felt fascinating. She asked questions about my background, my childhood, and the traditions I grew up with. I asked questions about American holidays, family gatherings, and the way people built their lives in the United States. These conversations felt like opening two different books at the same time. Each page revealed something new. For example, I was surprised by how openly many Americans express their opinions. In some cultures, people choose words very carefully to avoid sounding too direct. In the United States, honesty often appears more openly in conversations. The first time I noticed this clearly, we were discussing a simple decision about weekend plans. I offered a suggestion politely, expecting a gentle response. Instead, she answered directly, "I don't really like that idea." Her tone was calm, not rude at all. But my brain needed a moment to process the directness of the sentence. In my cultural background, people sometimes soften disagreement with longer explanations or indirect language. That moment was small, but it showed me something important. Language carries culture inside it. Words do not exist alone. They travel with habits, expectations, and emotional meanings shaped by society. Anthropologists who study intercultural relationships often describe this phenomenon as hidden cultural rules. These rules are rarely written anywhere, but people grow up learning them naturally. For example, how long someone should maintain eye contact, how directly someone should express disagreement, even how people interpret silence during a conversation. When two people from different cultures build a relationship, these invisible rules sometimes collide. Our relationship began discovering those collisions slowly. One evening we were cooking dinner together. Cooking is one of those everyday activities where conversation flows naturally. While cutting vegetables, she told me about an argument she once had with a friend. The story was full of emotional details. She explained how she felt, what she said, and how the situation eventually resolved. When she finished, she asked a question. "What would you have done?" My answer came from my cultural instinct. I explained that in my opinion, avoiding direct conflict might have been a better solution. She looked surprised. "Avoid it?" she asked. Her reaction made me realize something fascinating. In many American cultural contexts, open discussion is often seen as a healthy way to resolve problems. Avoiding the issue can sometimes be interpreted as ignoring the problem. Two cultures. Two interpretations of the same situation. Neither one was wrong. They were simply different. This realization slowly changed the way I listened, not only to English words, but also to the cultural meaning behind them. And that is where my English practice began playing an unexpected role. When I listened to English stories, I was not only learning vocabulary. I was also observing how people expressed emotions, disagreements, humor, and support. Stories became windows into American thinking. Language researchers often explain that storytelling provides contextual learning. Instead of memorizing isolated phrases, learners see how language functions within real situations. This helps the brain connect meaning more deeply. For example, through stories I started noticing how Americans often express appreciation verbally. Phrases like, "I appreciate that," or "that means a lot to me," appear frequently in everyday conversation. In some cultures, appreciation may be expressed through actions rather than words. Understanding this difference helped me communicate more clearly. Instead of assuming someone understood my gratitude, I began saying it directly. Small changes like that created surprising improvements in our communication. But relationships are never built only on easy moments. As our love grew stronger, the emotional stakes also grew higher. Conversations about the future started appearing more often. Topics like career, family expectations, and long-term plans slowly entered our discussions. And these conversations required more than basic language skills. They required emotional clarity. One evening we were sitting on a quiet bench in a park. The sun was setting behind the buildings, and the air carried that peaceful feeling that comes just before night. She asked a question that sounded simple, but carried deep meaning. "What kind of life do you want here?" Her voice was calm, but the question opened a door to a much larger conversation. Life in America meant different possibilities, different challenges, and different responsibilities than the life I had known before. Building a future together meant finding ways to combine two cultural perspectives into one shared direction. Answering her question required more than vocabulary. It required honesty. I spoke slowly, choosing my words carefully. Not because I was afraid of the language, but because I wanted my meaning to be clear. In that moment, I realized something important about learning English. Fluency is not only about speed. Fluency is about connection. When words truly represent what you feel, communication becomes powerful. But cultural differences still have a way of surprising you when you least expect them. Just when we believed we were understanding each other better, something unexpected happened, something that showed me how important language practice had truly become. Because one small misunderstanding was about to create our first serious conflict. And strangely enough, that conflict started with a single English sentence I thought I understood perfectly. English practice became my survival tool. A relationship can survive many things: distance, stress, even cultural differences. But one thing every relationship truly depends on is communication. Without clear communication, emotions become puzzles. Intentions become guesses. And small misunderstandings can slowly grow into large frustrations. That was the stage where my life in the United States was heading. By this time, my relationship with the woman who would later become my wife had already grown stronger. We spent more time together, shared more experiences, and slowly began imagining a future that included both of us. But there was still one challenge quietly following me everywhere.
English.
Not the English from textbooks. Not the English from grammar exercises. The real English of everyday life. The fast conversations, the emotional discussions, the jokes. The subtle expressions that carry meaning far beyond the words themselves. Every time a serious conversation began, I felt the pressure. My brain worked quickly, translating ideas while also trying to express feelings clearly. Sometimes I succeeded. Other times my sentences felt incomplete, like unfinished bridges between two minds. One evening revealed this challenge more clearly than ever. We were sitting together in her living room after dinner. The room was quiet except for soft music playing in the background. Outside the window, the city lights reflected against the dark sky. She started talking about something important, our future. Not in a dramatic way. Just a thoughtful conversation about where life might take us. She spoke about career goals, where we might want to live someday, and how relationships require commitment from both people. I listened carefully, focusing on every word, but somewhere in the conversation, my brain misunderstood a key sentence. I responded with an answer that sounded logical to me, but her reaction changed immediately. Her face showed confusion. "That's not what I meant," she said gently. The moment felt heavier than it should have. Not because we were arguing, but because both of us suddenly realized how fragile communication could be when language wasn't completely clear. That night, I went home thinking about something simple, but powerful. If I truly wanted this relationship to grow, improving my English was no longer just a personal goal. It had become a survival tool. And like any survival tool, it needed regular practice. Around that time, I started paying closer attention to how people actually learn languages successfully. Language researchers often explain that the brain learns most efficiently when information is repeated within meaningful contexts. In simpler terms, the brain remembers words better when they appear inside stories rather than isolated lists. This idea changed my approach completely. Instead of spending hours memorizing random vocabulary, I began practicing English through storytelling every day. I listened to slow English stories about life, relationships, and everyday situations. Stories where sentences were clear, natural, and connected to real emotions. At first, the progress felt subtle. But after several weeks, something surprising began happening. Conversations became easier. My brain started recognizing patterns faster. Expressions that once confused me suddenly felt familiar. When someone used an idiom, my mind could connect it to a story I had heard before. Language scientists call this process pattern recognition. The brain gradually builds a network of connections between sounds, meanings, and situations. The more often these connections appear, the stronger they become. In other words, language fluency grows through repetition within meaningful experiences. Stories provide exactly that. So I created a simple routine. Every day I listened to English stories for a short period of time. I repeated key sentences aloud. I practiced speaking slowly, focusing on clarity instead of speed. Something interesting happened during this process. My listening ability improved, but something else improved too. My patience. Instead of feeling embarrassed when I didn't understand something, I became curious. I started asking questions during conversations. Could you explain that phrase? Do you mean this or something else? To my surprise, those questions didn't create awkward moments. They created better communication. My partner appreciated the effort. She saw that I truly wanted to understand her thoughts instead of simply pretending to follow the conversation. And that effort strengthened our relationship. Psychologists who study relationships often emphasize the importance of active listening. Active listening means focusing fully on what the other person is saying instead of preparing your response too quickly. Language learning naturally encourages this habit. When listening carefully to understand a second language, your brain slows down and becomes more attentive to details. Tone of voice, pauses, and emotional cues become easier to notice. In many ways, learning English was teaching me how to listen better as a partner. But life always has another lesson waiting. Just when I felt my confidence growing, something unexpected happened. One simple misunderstanding, a small sentence interpreted incorrectly, created the first real conflict in our relationship. Not a quiet confusion, a real argument. And in that moment, I realized how powerful language can be. Because the same English words that help people connect can also create distance when they are misunderstood. That conflict taught me one of the most important lessons about relationships, communication, and life in the United States. And it all started with one sentence I thought I understood perfectly. Our first big misunderstanding. Misunderstandings rarely arrive with warning signs. They usually begin quietly, one sentence, one tone of voice. One interpretation that feels correct in the moment, but carries a completely different meaning for the other person. That is exactly how our first real conflict began. Until that point, most of our misunderstandings had been small. A phrase that sounded confusing. A cultural reference I didn't fully understand. A joke that my brain needed an extra few seconds to process. But those moments usually ended with laughter. This time was different. The situation started during a very ordinary afternoon. We were discussing plans for the weekend. Nothing serious, nothing emotional, just a simple conversation about how to spend a free day together. She suggested visiting some friends. I thought she meant something slightly different. In English, small changes in tone or phrasing can change the entire meaning of a sentence. Native speakers notice these differences naturally, but language learners sometimes miss them. When she spoke, my brain focused on the words themselves, but missed the intention behind them. So I answered quickly. My response sounded logical to me, but to her it sounded dismissive. Her expression changed immediately. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. The question itself was calm, but I could feel the atmosphere shift. Something in my answer had created a misunderstanding. I tried to explain what I thought she meant, but that explanation only made the situation more confusing. Suddenly, we were having two completely different conversations. She was reacting to the meaning she heard. I was defending the meaning I thought I had said. Communication experts often describe this as a meaning gap. The words spoken and the words heard carry different emotional interpretations. And when emotions become involved, misunderstandings can grow quickly. For the first time in our relationship, frustration appeared in both of our voices. Not anger exactly, but tension. The kind of tension that happens when two people care about each other, but feel temporarily disconnected. For a moment the room became quiet. Silence in a conversation can be powerful. It gives the brain time to think, but it can also allow negative assumptions to grow if the silence lasts too long. Inside my mind, several thoughts appeared at the same time. Maybe my English wasn't good enough. Maybe I had misunderstood her completely. Maybe the conversation was already moving too fast for me to correct the mistake. These thoughts are very common among language learners. Psychologists sometimes call this reaction communication anxiety. When someone feels uncertain about their language ability, the brain becomes more sensitive to mistakes. Instead of focusing on solutions, the mind starts worrying about judgment. Fortunately, something important happened during that quiet moment. Instead of continuing the argument, she took a slow breath and asked a simple question. Wait, what did you think I meant? That question changed everything. Suddenly the conversation moved away from blame and toward clarification. I explained how I had interpreted her sentence. She listened carefully, then explained the meaning she originally intended. Within a few minutes, we realized something almost funny. Both of us had been reacting to meanings that the other person never intended. The misunderstanding was not about disagreement. It was about interpretation. Language researchers often point out that second language learners sometimes focus heavily on individual words while missing the emotional tone surrounding them. Native speakers, however, process tone and context automatically. That difference can easily create small communication gaps. Once we understood what had happened, the tension slowly disappeared. But the experience left an important lesson. Words are powerful. When they are understood clearly, they build connection. When they are misunderstood, they can create confusion even between people who care deeply about each other. That evening we talked for a long time, not about the weekend plans anymore, but about communication itself. We discussed how cultural habits influence conversation styles and how language learning requires patience from both people involved. Something interesting happened during that conversation. Instead of feeling discouraged, I felt motivated. The misunderstanding had revealed exactly where I needed to improve. Listening more carefully, asking questions sooner, and continuing my daily English practice with even more attention. Scientific studies about language acquisition often show that mistakes are not signs of failure. They are signals pointing toward areas where the brain still needs practice. In fact, learners who actively reflect on misunderstandings often improve faster because they become more aware of communication patterns. That night, the argument that could have damaged our relationship actually strengthened it. Not because conflict is good, but because we chose curiosity instead of blame. From that point forward, I became even more serious about practicing English through real stories and real conversations. Each story became training for the brain, training that slowly improved both my language skills and my ability to understand emotions behind words. Still, life had another lesson waiting. Because language misunderstandings are only one part of intercultural relationships. There was another challenge I had not fully explored yet. Listening itself. Not just hearing words. Truly listening. And that lesson would appear in a surprising way during the next stage of our journey, when I discovered that learning to listen slowly could change everything. The secret of listening slowly. Speed is one of the most invisible challenges in language learning. When people speak quickly, your brain tries to chase every word, every sound, every meaning at the same time. It feels like running behind a fast train. You see the direction, but you can't quite catch it. For a long time, that was exactly how English conversations felt to me in the United States. Even after months of living there, some conversations still moved faster than my brain could process. My listening ability was improving, but real-life conversations didn't slow down just because I needed more time. And that created a quiet kind of stress, not the dramatic stress people talk about in movies. A smaller, everyday tension. The tension of trying to understand everything while also trying to respond naturally. Then something simple changed my perspective. One evening, after the misunderstanding we had earlier in our relationship, I decided to experiment with a new learning habit. Instead of forcing myself to follow fast conversations all the time, I began practicing English in a slower way. I started listening to English stories spoken slowly and clearly. At first, many people believe learning must feel difficult to be effective. They imagine complicated grammar rules, long vocabulary lists, or intense study sessions late at night. But the human brain actually learns language in a very different way. Neuroscientists explain that the brain processes language more efficiently when it has enough time to recognize patterns. If speech is too fast, the brain focuses on survival, trying to catch individual words instead of understanding the full meaning. But when speech slows down slightly, the brain has time to connect words, emotions, and context together. This process is sometimes called deep listening. And deep listening changes everything. The first time I practiced this method seriously, I noticed something surprising. While listening to a slow English story, my brain stopped feeling rushed. Instead of chasing each word, I could observe the rhythm of the sentence, the rise and fall of the voice, the pauses between ideas, the emotion behind the words. Suddenly, English didn't sound like a puzzle anymore. It sounded like communication. After a few weeks of daily listening practice, something interesting started happening during real conversations with my partner. Instead of feeling pressure to respond immediately, I allowed myself to listen more carefully. When she spoke, I paid attention not only to vocabulary but also to tone. I noticed when her voice became softer, when it became more energetic, and when she paused before finishing a thought. Listening slowly created more understanding, and more understanding created more patience. Relationship psychologists often explain that listening is one of the most powerful forms of respect. When someone feels truly heard, emotional connection becomes stronger. In many ways, learning English was teaching me the same skill that strengthens healthy relationships: attention, curiosity, presence. One evening we were walking through the city after dinner. The streets were alive with lights and conversations. People passed by speaking quickly, laughing, sharing stories. In the middle of that busy environment, we were having a calm conversation about our week. At one point, she said something about a problem she had experienced at work. In the past, I might have tried to answer immediately, offering advice or responding quickly to keep the conversation moving. But this time I did something different. I listened, not just to the words, to the meaning, to the emotion behind them. When she finished speaking, there was a small pause. Then I asked a simple question. How did that make you feel? Her reaction surprised me. She smiled. That's exactly what I was trying to explain, she said. That moment may sound small, but it represented a big shift in our communication. By slowing down my listening, I was understanding her experience more clearly. And something else happened too. My English responses became more natural. Language researchers often describe a phenomenon called input before output. In simple terms, the brain needs enough listening exposure before it can produce fluent speech. The more stories and conversations you hear, the more natural your own speaking becomes. That was happening to me without forcing it. Through slow listening practice, my brain was building a stronger foundation for speaking. Instead of translating ideas from my native language into English, I started thinking more directly in English. Sentences appeared more smoothly. Expressions felt more familiar. Confidence slowly replaced anxiety. And that confidence improved our relationship in ways I didn't expect. Because when communication becomes easier, emotional connection grows naturally. But life in the United States continued teaching us new lessons. Cultural differences don't disappear simply because communication improves. They appear in daily routines, family expectations, and even the way people build their homes and raise their children. Our relationship was about to face another stage of growth, one that involved adapting not only to language, but to the entire rhythm of American life. And that lesson began when we started building something bigger than conversations. A shared life. One shaped by climate, culture, and the everyday realities of living in the United States. Life lessons from American culture. Life in the United States teaches you many things that textbooks never mention. Grammar books can explain sentence structure. Vocabulary lists can help you remember words. But neither of them can fully prepare you for the everyday rhythm of American culture. And culture, as I slowly learned, has a powerful influence on relationships. When two people come from different cultural backgrounds, they bring invisible habits into their daily life. These habits shape how they talk, how they solve problems, and even how they show love. At first, those differences can feel small. But when two lives begin to merge, sharing homes, routines, responsibilities, those differences become much more visible. That was exactly the stage my relationship had reached. By this time, my English listening and speaking skills had improved noticeably. Practicing with slow English stories every day had trained my brain to recognize patterns faster. Conversations felt smoother. Misunderstandings were less frequent. But language was only one part of the experience. Living in America introduced many new realities that required adjustment. One of the first things I noticed was the rhythm of daily life. In the United States, time seems to move quickly. People schedule their days carefully. Meetings, appointments, work hours, and personal activities often follow structured timelines. In my cultural background, daily life sometimes felt more flexible. Conversations could last longer without worrying about the clock. Plans could change easily. In America, however, time often feels like a resource people manage very carefully. At first, this difference surprised me. For example, one evening we were planning dinner with friends. I suggested arriving a little later than the exact time mentioned, thinking it would not matter much. She gently explained something important. In the U.S., people usually try to arrive close to the time they planned. It was a small detail, but it revealed something deeper about cultural expectations. Anthropologists sometimes describe cultures as either time-oriented or relationship-oriented. Time-oriented cultures tend to value punctuality and schedules. Relationship-oriented cultures may focus more on flexibility and social interaction. Neither approach is better or worse. They are simply different ways of organizing life. Understanding these differences helped me navigate everyday situations more smoothly. But cultural lessons didn't stop with time management. Another area that surprised me was communication style within families. In many American households, open discussion is encouraged, even with children. Parents often invite kids to express their opinions, ask questions, and participate in decisions. This approach felt different from the environment where I grew up, where family roles sometimes followed more traditional structures. One afternoon, we were visiting her parents. The family was sitting around the table discussing various topics: work, news, and future plans. What impressed me most was how naturally everyone participated in the conversation. People listened to each other carefully, responded respectfully, and even disagreed openly, without creating tension. Watching that interaction taught me something important. Healthy communication requires space for different perspectives, and language plays a central role in creating that space. Because my English had improved through story-based listening practice, I could follow these conversations more comfortably. Instead of feeling lost, I could observe how ideas flowed from one person to another. I noticed how people use phrases like, "I see your point." That's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about it that way. These expressions help conversations stay respectful even when opinions differ. For language learners, phrases like these are extremely valuable. They allow you to participate in discussions without sounding aggressive or dismissive. Through stories and daily conversations, I gradually absorbed these patterns. But perhaps the most interesting cultural lesson involved emotional expression. In American culture, people often express appreciation verbally. Words like "thank you," "I appreciate it," and "that means a lot" appear frequently in everyday interactions. At first, this level of verbal appreciation felt slightly unfamiliar to me. But once I understood the cultural value behind it, I began using these expressions more naturally. And something surprising happened. Those small phrases strengthened emotional connection. My partner noticed the effort. She felt understood, and I felt more confident communicating in her cultural environment. Relationship experts often explain that small verbal affirmations can significantly improve emotional satisfaction in relationships. When appreciation is expressed clearly, both partners feel recognized and valued. Learning these communication habits became another benefit of practicing English through real stories and real conversations. Still, cultural differences do not disappear completely. They simply become easier to understand. Even with better communication, every relationship eventually faces difficult moments. Stress from work, responsibilities, and life decisions can create tension. And one night, all those pressures combined in a way neither of us expected. It was not about language this time. It was not even about culture alone. It was about something deeper, the fear that sometimes appears when people wonder whether love is strong enough to survive life's challenges. That night would become one of the most important moments in our journey together. Because for the first time, we both quietly wondered if our relationship might be reaching its limit. And the conversation that followed would test everything we had learned about communication, patience, and understanding. The night we almost gave up. Some moments in life arrive quietly, without warning. There is no dramatic music, no obvious signal that something important is about to happen. Instead, the moment simply appears in the middle of an ordinary day. And only later do you realize how much it changed everything. The night our relationship was truly tested began in a very simple way. It was late evening, and the city outside was slowly becoming quieter. Cars still passed on the street, but the busy energy of the day had softened into the calm rhythm of night. Inside our apartment, the lights were warm and gentle. It should have felt like a peaceful moment, but something felt different. Both of us had experienced a long day. Work responsibilities, small frustrations, and the general pressure of daily life had quietly accumulated in our minds. None of these problems were dramatic by themselves, but together they created a heavy atmosphere. Sometimes stress doesn't appear as anger. Sometimes it appears as silence. We sat in the living room, each of us thinking about different things. Eventually the conversation started, but it moved slowly and carefully. She spoke first. I feel like we've both been under a lot of pressure lately. Her voice wasn't accusing. It sounded thoughtful, almost reflective. But the sentence opened a door to deeper emotions. I nodded. Living in the United States had been an exciting journey, but it also carried responsibilities and uncertainties. Building a life together in a new environment requires effort from both people. Language, culture, work, expectations about the future. These topics can quietly influence how partners feel over time. Relationship researchers often describe this stage as a stress intersection. Two people who care deeply about each other begin facing external pressures at the same time. Without strong communication, those pressures can slowly affect the relationship itself. That evening felt like one of those intersections. She continued speaking. Sometimes I wonder if we're making things harder than they need to be. Her words were not harsh, but they carried honest concern. And honesty, while important, can sometimes feel uncomfortable when emotions are already sensitive. For a moment, my mind reacted defensively. The human brain has a natural instinct to protect itself during difficult conversations. Psychologists call this reaction the defensive response. When someone feels uncertain or criticized, the brain quickly searches for arguments or explanations. But something inside me paused that instinct. Maybe it was the listening habits I had developed while practicing English stories. Maybe it was the awareness that misunderstandings had already challenged our relationship before. Instead of reacting immediately, I listened. Really listened. She wasn't attacking our relationship. She was expressing fear. Fear that cultural differences, communication challenges, and life stress might slowly pull us apart. That realization changed the tone of the conversation in my mind. Instead of defending myself, I tried to understand what she was feeling. I think we're both trying, I said slowly. But sometimes trying can still feel exhausting. She looked at me quietly. Yes, she replied. That's exactly it. The conversation continued, moving deeper into topics we had rarely discussed so openly before. We talked about the difficulty of balancing personal goals with relationship responsibilities. We talked about the emotional energy required to adapt to cultural differences. and we talked about something that many couples eventually face.
Doubt.
Not the kind of doubt that destroys love immediately, but the quiet question that sometimes appears in difficult moments. Is this going to work? It's important to understand that doubt does not mean love has disappeared. In fact, psychologists often explain that moments of doubt can appear in even the strongest relationships. What matters most is how people respond to those moments. Some couples avoid the conversation. Others confront it honestly. That night, we chose honesty. At one point, she asked a question that felt both simple and powerful. Do you ever feel like giving up? The question hung in the air between us. For a few seconds, I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to avoid the truth, but because I wanted my response to be sincere. Finally, I spoke. Sometimes things feel difficult, I admitted. But giving up has never felt like the right answer. Her expression softened slightly. What makes you so sure? She asked. I thought about that question carefully. The answer was not something complicated. It was something surprisingly simple. Because every time we misunderstand each other, I said, we also learn something new about how to communicate better. Silence filled the room again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, reflective. The conversation continued for a long time that night. Instead of focusing on problems, we began discussing solutions, small changes that could improve how we communicated and supported each other. And strangely enough, many of those solutions came back to the same habit that had already helped me improve my English. Listening. Listening slowly. Listening with curiosity instead of judgment. Language practice had taught me patience, and that patience became one of the most valuable tools in our relationship. By the time the conversation ended, the tension that had filled the room earlier had faded. Nothing magical had happened. No problem disappeared overnight. But something important had shifted. We had faced out honestly and chosen to continue. Still, one more unexpected moment was waiting just around the corner. A moment that would transform everything we had discussed that night into a single, powerful realization. And that realization would arrive through something very small. Just one simple English sentence. One simple English sentence. Sometimes the most powerful changes in life come from very small moments. Not long speeches. Not dramatic events. Just a single sentence spoken at the right time. After the difficult conversation we had that night, something inside our relationship felt calmer, but also more honest. We had faced the tension directly. We had spoken about our doubts and fears without pretending everything was perfect. But honesty alone doesn't solve everything. Real change usually begins with small actions that slowly transform everyday habits. A few days after that conversation, something unexpected happened during a simple moment that would stay in my memory for a long time. It was early evening. The sky outside had that soft orange color that appears just before sunset. We were sitting at the kitchen table finishing dinner. Nothing special was happening, just a quiet moment after a normal day. She was telling me about something that had happened at work. Her story involved a small problem with a project, a misunderstanding between coworkers, and the pressure of deadlines. While she spoke, I listened carefully. By this time, my listening habits had changed a lot. Instead of trying to respond quickly, I focused on understanding the meaning behind her words. The slow English story practice I had been doing every day had trained my brain to stay calm during conversations. My attention followed her voice, her tone, the pauses between sentences. When she finished speaking, there was a short moment of silence. In the past, I might have tried to give advice immediately. Many people feel the need to solve problems quickly when someone shares a difficult experience. But that evening, a different response appeared naturally in my mind. A simple sentence. I understand how you feel. The moment I said it, something changed in the atmosphere of the room. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. The tension in her expression softened. Thank you, she said quietly. That moment lasted only a few seconds, but it revealed something powerful. Sometimes people do not need immediate solutions. Sometimes they simply want to feel understood. Communication researchers often explain that emotional validation is one of the most important elements in healthy relationships. When someone feels that their emotions are recognized and respected, trust grows naturally. The sentence, I understand how you feel, is simple, but it carries a deep message. It says, I am listening. It says, your experience matters. It says, you are not alone in this moment. And for language learners, sentences like this are extremely valuable because they are both emotionally meaningful and linguistically simple. In fact, psychologists who study interpersonal communication often recommend practicing empathetic phrases in daily conversation. These phrases help create connection before solutions are discussed. Other examples include, that sounds difficult. I can see why that would be frustrating. I'm glad you told me. Through English stories and daily listening practice, I had heard these kind of phrases many times. Slowly, they had become part of my natural speaking habits. And that small change made a big difference. Instead of rushing conversations forward, our discussions became more balanced. We listened more carefully to each other. We asked more questions. Over time, these small habits strengthened the emotional foundation of our relationship. Something interesting also happened inside my brain during this period. Because I had spent so much time listening to real-life English stories, my mind began thinking more directly in English. The translation process that once slowed me down started disappearing. Language scientists describe this stage as automaticity. When learners receive enough meaningful input, their brains begin producing language naturally, without conscious translation. For me, this meant conversations flowed more smoothly. My confidence increased. And that confidence improved not only my language skills, but also the quality of our relationship. One evening, a few weeks later, we were taking a walk through a neighborhood park. The air was cool, and the sound of distant traffic mixed with the quiet rhythm of people walking their dogs or jogging along the path. During that walk, she said something thoughtful. You know, she began, I think we understand each other better now than we did before. Her observation made me smile, because I realized she was right. Our relationship had not become stronger because our cultural differences disappeared. It had become stronger because we had learned how to communicate across those differences. And communication requires two simple ingredients: patience and practice. Just like learning a language. The more we practiced listening and expressing ourselves honestly, the easier it became to navigate challenges together. But life was about to introduce another chapter in our story, one that would bring even deeper meaning to everything we had learned about. Communication, patience, and cultural understanding. Because relationships change in a powerful way when family enters the picture. And soon, our journey in the United States would expand beyond just the two of us. A new beginning was waiting. One that would involve children, responsibility, and a deeper understanding of what it truly means to build a life together. When love becomes responsibility, life has a quiet way of changing the meaning of relationships over time. In the beginning, love often feels exciting and emotional. Two people discover each other, share dreams, and imagine a future together. But as the years pass, love slowly transforms into something deeper. Responsibility, commitment, partnership. Our relationship had already survived language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. We had learned how to communicate more honestly. We had learned patience. We had learned how powerful listening can be. But life was preparing us for a new stage that would test those lessons even further. One evening, several months after the difficult period we had experienced, we were sitting together reviewing plans for the future. Conversations about the future had become more common lately. Work goals, financial plans, where we wanted to live. And eventually, one topic appeared naturally in the conversation.
Family.
The idea of building a family brings both excitement and responsibility. It invites people to imagine a future that extends beyond themselves. At the same time, it raises many important questions. Are we ready? Can we provide stability? Will our cultural differences make parenting more complicated? These questions appeared gently in our discussion that night. She spoke first. If we have children one day, she said thoughtfully, they will grow up between cultures. Her observation was accurate. Children raised in multicultural families often experience a unique identity. They learn to navigate different traditions, languages, and social expectations. For some families, this can feel complicated, but it can also be an incredible gift. Research in developmental psychology often shows that children exposed to multiple languages and cultures develop strong cognitive flexibility. They learn to adapt to different perspectives more easily. Still, raising children requires more than cultural awareness. It requires teamwork. And teamwork begins with communication. As we continued talking, I realized something important. The communication habits we had built through our challenges were now becoming the foundation for future decisions. We were no longer discussing problems. We were discussing possibilities. Instead of asking, can our relationship survive cultural differences? We were asking a new question. How can our differences become strengths for the life we want to build? This shift in perspective felt powerful. A few weeks later, we visited a local community event in our neighborhood. Families were everywhere. Children playing, parents talking, music in the background, people sharing food and laughter. Watching those families interact created a quiet reflection inside my mind. Relationships are not only about romantic connection. They're about building environments where people can grow together. That evening we met a couple who had been married for more than 30 years. They shared stories about their early struggles, their cultural differences, and the challenges they had faced when raising their children. One thing they said stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Love isn't about avoiding problems, the husband explained with a smile. It's about learning how to solve them together. His wife nodded and added something equally meaningful. And sometimes the problems actually teach you how to become a better partner. Their words echoed many of the lessons we had already experienced. Challenges had forced us to communicate more clearly. Language learning had trained us to listen patiently. Cultural differences had encouraged curiosity instead of judgment. All these elements were quietly preparing us for the next chapter of life. Later that night, after returning home, we continued discussing what we had learned from that couple's story. One important realization became clear. Every strong relationship eventually transforms into a partnership focused on shared growth. Growth in communication. Growth in emotional understanding. Growth in responsibility. And growth rarely happens without effort, just like learning English. No one becomes fluent overnight. Progress appears slowly, through consistent practice and meaningful interaction. Relationships follow a similar pattern. They improve when people invest time, patience, and honest communication. As we talked, she asked a thoughtful question. Do you think we would have learned these lessons if everything had been easy? I considered that question carefully. Probably not. Difficulty had forced us to slow down, reflect, and improve the way we communicated. Without those challenges, we might never have developed the listening habits and emotional awareness that now supported our relationship. In a strange way, our earlier struggles had become valuable teachers. They had shown us how to navigate differences instead of avoiding them. They had shown us how powerful understanding can be. And perhaps most importantly, they had shown us that love is not only a feeling. Love is also a decision to listen, a decision to grow, a decision to stay committed even when life becomes complicated. Still, one final realization was waiting for us. A realization that would bring together everything we had experienced: language learning, cultural differences, emotional growth, and the deeper meaning of relationships. And that final realization would appear in the most unexpected place. Inside a simple English learning routine that had quietly transformed not only my language skills, but also the way we understood each other. The lesson that followed would become the most important message of this entire story. The lesson that changed everything. Looking back on the journey now, something becomes very clear. The biggest challenge in our relationship was never really about language. It wasn't only about culture either. Those differences were real, but they were not the true obstacle. The real challenge was learning how to understand each other deeply. And that kind of understanding rarely happens quickly. It grows slowly, through conversations, through mistakes, through patience, and through the willingness to keep trying even when things feel difficult. When I first arrived in the United States, my focus was simple. I wanted to improve my English. I wanted to speak more clearly, listen more confidently, and participate in conversations without feeling nervous or confused. The process of learning English began changing the way I approached communication itself. Listening carefully to slow English stories trained my mind to focus on meaning instead of reacting immediately. Practicing simple sentences helped me express ideas more clearly and calmly. Repeating everyday conversations helped me understand emotions behind words. These small habits slowly transformed not only my language ability, but also my relationships. Because communication in any language depends on the same foundation: attention, respect, curiosity. Many people believe that strong relationships depend mostly on emotions. Love, attraction, excitement. These feelings certainly play an important role. But long-term relationships depend even more on communication. Two people must learn how to share thoughts honestly, how to express concerns without attacking, how to listen without preparing arguments. These skills do not appear automatically. They're learned. And strangely enough, language learning can help develop those exact abilities. Every time you listen carefully to understand a story in another language, you are training patience. Every time you repeat a sentence slowly to pronounce it clearly, you are practicing mindfulness. Every time you ask someone to explain something you didn't understand, you are building humility. All these qualities strengthen communication. And strong communication strengthens relationships. One evening, not long ago, we were sitting together reflecting on everything we had experienced since the beginning of our journey in the United States. The early misunderstandings, the cultural surprises, the difficult conversations, and the small improvements that gradually brought us closer together. She smiled and said something that summarized the entire experience perfectly. "You know," she said, "learning English didn't just help you speak better." I looked at her curiously. It helped us understand each other better. Her sentence captured the lesson I had slowly been discovering. Language is more than vocabulary and grammar. Language is a bridge. It connects thoughts, emotions, and perspectives between people who might otherwise remain separated by misunderstanding. And when people take time to strengthen that bridge, something powerful happens. Trust grows. Patience increases. And relationships become more resilient. Of course, no relationship is perfect. Even today, we still experience moments of disagreement or confusion. That is a normal part of any long-term partnership. But now we face those moments differently. Instead of reacting quickly, we slow down. Instead of assuming negative intentions, we ask questions. Instead of focusing on who is right, we focus on understanding. These habits did not appear overnight. They developed slowly through practice, just like learning a language. And that realization leads to an important message for anyone watching this video. Difficult moments in relationships do not always mean something is broken. Sometimes they simply mean communication needs to grow. Just as language learners improve by listening, repeating, and practicing, couples improve by sharing, listening, and learning from each other. The question that appeared at the beginning of this story still remains powerful. Will you fight for your relationship? Fighting for a relationship does not mean arguing loudly or trying to win every disagreement. Real effort looks different. It means choosing patience instead of frustration. It means choosing curiosity instead of judgment. It means continuing to communicate, even when conversations feel uncomfortable. And most importantly, it means remembering why the relationship mattered in the first place. Because behind every difficult conversation, there is usually something valuable worth protecting. Understanding. Connection.
Love.
If this story helped you reflect on your own communication, your own relationships, or your own English learning journey, then its purpose has already been fulfilled. Because the goal of stories like this is not only to teach language, it is to encourage growth. Growth in understanding, growth in patience, growth in the courage to keep improving. And if you are still watching this video right now, it means you have already taken one important step. You chose not to give up, not on learning, not on understanding, and hopefully not on the relationships that matter most in your life. Thank you for spending this time practicing English, and reflecting on this journey together. And remember something simple but powerful. Every conversation is an opportunity to understand someone a little better. And sometimes that understanding can change everything. Sometimes a relationship is not destroyed by big arguments or dramatic moments. Sometimes it slowly weakens because two people stop listening, stop trying, or stop understanding each other's world. This story was never only about marriage, and it was never only about learning English. It was about something deeper. The courage to keep learning when communication feels difficult. The courage to stay patient when cultural differences, language barriers, and daily stress test the connection between two people. Because the truth is simple. The same habit that helps someone improve their English listening skills can also strengthen a relationship. Slow down. Listen carefully. Try again. And sometimes that small effort changes everything. But this story is only one chapter. Across the United States, millions of people are facing the same silent questions right now. Will communication save their relationship? Will patience rebuild trust? Will learning to understand each other change their future? On this channel, we explore these real-life questions through real English story practice. Stories about life, relationships, culture, and emotional growth, designed to help you improve your English listening, speaking confidence, and real-world communication skills at the same time. So, if you believe that learning English should also help you understand people, culture, and life in the United States, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe now because the next story might reveal a lesson that changes the way you learn English and the way you understand relationships. And the next story we share may begin with an even more surprising question. What happens when love survives everything except silence?